that you would ever think someone would wish to assert. Please punish me. I have a right to it. But as we'll see, he's going to argue that this right is in a way inalienable, so you don't get to waive it. Right? It's unwaivable in a way. And it's derivative from the right to be treated as a person. But anyway, where we are now is we're contrasting two different models of how society might go about treating people whose behavior it doesn't like. And the first model is the punishment model. And as I explained last time, at least on Morris's treatment, the basic conception of society that we're dealing with here is as a contractualist version or a contractarian sort of version. And the idea is, look, we're of equal power or roughly equal power. We're competing for the same goods in a social environment. We need to restrain each other's liberty in order to have any prospects of security. So we each are going to agree to refrain from certain kinds of behaviors, right? So long as everyone else, right, agrees to do the same. So we're going to have the burden of giving up the ability to do a lot of things with the benefit of everybody else's agreeing not to do those sorts of things to us. Okay. So, so we agree to write a system of rules for how we will treat each other. Violations of those. Sorry. Yeah.
So his idea is that there's some like inalienable right we have to a system like that. He wants to look at like his idea is like respecting humanity of people. Is that inconsistent for him to say that that's why we would come to the contractualist model, simply to preserve our own ability to pursue our ends, and not rather that it's justified on account of we just shouldn't intervene?
Let me see if I can.
Yeah, that was
So well, no, I think you might be asking a really important question, but I'm not. Try it again.
Sure.
Try it again.
Well, we agree to the system of laws to restrain ourselves and to restrain others because we want to be able to pursue our own goals, kind of the way. Why is it justifying that on account of that's to do that? To interfere with others would be to not respect their persons, which seems to be the unifying theme here, or at least something he's really concerned with.
So I think the order goes like this. We would choose to do this kind of thing. We effectively have, right, enter into this agreement. And because we are persons entitled to respect, this sort of system, operating by this sort of system, which is a system founded on the idea of individuals making free choices that have consequences and knowing what those consequences are, right? Because we are entitled to be treated as persons, this sort of system is something we are entitled to because it respects us. It respects our choices. So I don't think the argument costs to other persons. Right? We want to treat we want what we want, and we don't care what anyone else wants. Right? And the only reason, or rather, the only reason we care what anyone else wants is that it will do us good to give them a certain amount of liberty from us if they will agree to give us a certain amount of liberty from them. But this is supposed to be a completely self-interested move on the part of each individual. So it's not so that I can treat you as a person that I agree not to interfere with you. It's so that you won't interfere with me. Okay. So there is a kind of a paradox here. It's like, out of pure self-interest that has no regard for anyone else, right? I would agree, he thinks, to a certain kind of arrangement, and because I'm a person whose choices are entitled to respect, that's a more fundamental point, right? This sort of system, which is founded on the idea that I act only out of self-interest, right, is one that we will support. Is one that is right. There's an interesting tension there. That would make a really interesting sort of paper. Anyway, okay, good thought. So it also. Yes, Christopher. What you said, as far as that goes, that's right in line with his points here. Okay, so why is punishment, criminal penalties for violations, reasonable? Well, for one thing, they disincentivize violations. That is, they make it more likely that people will not commit the violations, and we've all agreed to the idea is to abide by these rules because they're good for us individually and if everyone keeps them. Okay. Second, they ensure fairness by making sure the burdens and benefits are equally shared. So the idea is if someone violates, they are getting the benefit without suffering the burden. And they erase the unfair advantage the criminal has gained by his violation. Now, do they really? Right? If I violate and steal your stuff, right, punishing me doesn't erase my debt to you. So what's all important here is how we conceive the debt. To whom does the violator owe a debt in committing the infraction? Okay, as Morris puts it, criminal has taken something that's not rightly his. He owes it back to the society from which he has taken it. Presumably, it's your car I stole, not society's car, right? So there's always that, what's the relationship between the victim and the punisher? What's the relationship between the victor and who it is to whom the criminal pays their debt, as it were, a debt to society. Okay. And this can also be done by forgiveness. So, in a just system of this sort, there are going to be defenses available against punishment. So people who cause a certain harm that you're not allowed to cause, there might be defenses. And right, they're going to be available where the occurrence of that harm or the occurrence of that action does not amount to a choice on the part of the agent to act unfairly. It says a person. So the idea is that what's wrong with criminal activity is that it provides an unfair advantage. So a person has not derived an unfair advantage if he could not have restrained himself or if it was unreasonable to expect him to behave otherwise than he did. In such cases, he says, the agent did not voluntarily renounce their burden. Okay? And you can ask, is that so? Right? If a person's action was entirely involuntary, like they had an epileptic fit that led them to destroy somebody's property or something like that, yeah, then they're clearly not choosing an unfair burden. But what about cases in which it's just unreasonable to expect compliance because, for example, the temptation is really great, or the person's will is weak, or there's really very little chance of detection? Then a person might choose to accept an unfair burden, but, right, they can't be expected to have done otherwise. It would be unreasonable to expect them to have done otherwise. So I think this is a small point, but it goes to just what does he mean by unreasonable to expect them to behave otherwise than they did? Okay, in any event, it's clear that the precise violation of fairness Morris has in mind here lies in the unequal distribution of burdens and benefits of renunciation of interference. It isn't so much harm to others that is to be righted by punishment here, but rather the extra share of liberty the criminal has taken, thus disturbing some equilibrium. But again, we typically think of punishment as deserved because of the harm the offender does to their victim, not because of some unfair share of liberty they have helped themselves to. So it's very important that you understand that that is the thing that warrants punishment, is the unfair helping yourself to a bit of liberty, and not the fact that you've harmed someone. Okay. Criminal rules, in order to make sense in a system like this, will have to be public and prospective, because violating a rule you don't have reason to know of is not a matter of choosing to take unfair advantage. There will be rules requiring proof of guilt and rules to ensure that only the guilty are convicted. And this, he says, is because the conviction of an innocent is a worse wrong than the failure to punish a guilty party, because the whole purpose of the rules is to provide a protected sphere of activity for those who do comply. So since the rules, the criminal rules are supposed to, or the laws are supposed to provide to serve those who comply with them, they're in the service of the compliant. It's wrong to punish someone who was compliant, and in a way that is more wrong than it is wrong to not punish someone who isn't compliant. So all of this is seen as a product of a coordinated rational choice. A person who violates the coordinated rational choice acts unfairly. She accepts the burden, the benefit of other people's burden of non-interference, but rejects the same burden and doesn't return the benefit to others. So they're in effect a free rider. That's what's wrong with criminal activity. It's free riding. Moreover, because of the publicity of the rules and the consequences for the violation, a person who chooses to violate can plausibly be seen to have chosen their punishment, says Morris. Now, I got to admit, this seems mildly lunatic to me. They chose to accept, at best, some risk of punishment. Moreover, unless the system is substantively fair in terms of how much liberty people actually have to act on their desires without the interference of others, unless it's substantively just, then this violation of an abstract mutual agreement to accept the burden of non-interference hardly seems like a rational choice to be punished. It hardly seems like what you're doing there is, choosing to be punished. So, like, think of poverty-stricken people in disadvantaged communities that have been suffering systematic injustice for generations, okay? Is that person's choice to shoplift or something like that, right? Or jack a car, right, for parts? Is that person's choice a choice of punishment in the same way that, right, look, the fact is, they're much more likely to be punished for violating the law than an advantaged person who violates a law. So the substantive unfairnesses in the way that the punishments are meted out seem to me to make a sort of a mockery out of this idea that people's actions in violating the law are choices of their punishment. Anyway, yeah, Sam.
Is it even, how can we say that it's possible to know the consequence of a violation? Like, that seems to be taking some kind of stance on the deductibility of what that means in particular cases. These laws or rules will always be illegal. This is a thread we've talked about in terms of
I got you.
interpretation. But like, how can we say that the citizenry can always know that they are likely to suffer a consequence because?
Well, I think you can't really say that. I think at most people know that there's going to be some risk of detection and incarceration. I'm not choosing the punishment. I'm choosing to run the risk that there might be some punishment. Okay, and moreover, you don't really know. At best, that's the case. Mostly, I think it's just absurd to think of people who are committing criminal acts, especially violent criminal acts, as doing much in the way of making choices at all. I think often enough they're suffering a pathology of some sort. And this is going to go to the treatment model that he's going to talk about. But in fairness, Morris does concede that the conception he's putting forward here is ideal. It's an ideal conception, a pattern, a form that we're looking at in order to make sense of a practice. And it's not going to be met with in reality in a way that fully justifies what we'll say would follow from the idea, from the ideal conception of it. So that's to be fair to Morris. He knows that there's going to be some slippage in terms of, do people really choose their punishments? He doesn't so much assert that they do as say it can be a person can be plausibly seen that way, which is really nice hedge words, right? It's like, well, I can conceptualize you that way. I don't think it's literally true, but I can sort of understand you in that way. However, as ever, you have to really beware of inferences that move from, in the ideal situation, action A or whatever would be warranted, to the move, well, in a situation that approximates the ideal situation to a certain degree, that action would be warranted even to a relatively, to a degree relative to how closely the actual situation approximates the ideal. So that's a really dangerous kind of inference. We saw that in going on with the invocation of coast conditions in the, right, back in the law and economics stuff. If we're close to free market conditions, then we're close to efficiency. And that just doesn't follow. And this is another instance of how we have to be careful of that. Okay. Now let's contrast with the punishment system, the therapy system, treatment system. Here, right, regulations aim at the prevention of certain types of injuries and perceived harms. A person's bringing about such an injury or harm is to be understood as a kind of symptom of some pathological condition, a pathological condition that tends to produce such actions. And the particular action is like a manifestation of a disease. Since the aim of the system is to prevent such injuries and harm, what we need to do to the person who manifests a disposition to cause such harms is to give them therapy, is to treat them so that they are no longer in a pathological condition in which they are likely to produce such harms. Now, from the point of view of such a system, there's really no difference between a person's actions, their products of choice, and mere happenings involving their bodies. If a thug decides to assault you, and an epileptic having a seizure causes you the same injury that the thug caused, the only difference between these situations is the relevant treatment that's required. Right? The problem with the thug is that the thug is likely to commit assaults. The problem with the epileptic is they're likely to have a seizure that might injure someone. Okay? And they need different treatment is all. The fact that the thug made a choice and the epileptic didn't is irrelevant to the treatment system. Whatever values are served by the punishment system's way of distinguishing actions from mere happenings, think of the defenses against prosecution involved in, right? The person wasn't responsible for the action. Whatever values are served by that will not be served by the treatment system. And so its values can be expected to differ with respect to what difference it makes whether the person who caused the harm, for example, willingly did so, chose to do so, or not. Since violations are seen as signs not of, free choice, but as signs of abnormality or sickness, the response is therapy. But therapy and punishment are really very different things. Some of the features of the punishment system that are erased under the therapy system might be reintroduced, right, under different descriptions, but Morris is going to argue that under the new description, they still don't amount to treating the violator as a person. So, for example, you might incarcerate a violator and say that the point of doing so is rehabilitation, right? And you might incarcerate them in just the same way we incarcerate a criminal in order to respect their choice to incur a debt to society under the punishment system. But rehabilitation has nothing to do with respecting the agent as such and their choices. That's a matter of treatment. It's not a matter of punishment for violating an agreement, right? So there are various ways that treatment differs from punishment. And they're listed here. Punishment, but not treatment, is associated with fault or guilt. Punishment, but not therapy, seeks to deprive someone of a good. To punish someone on the punishment model, you're depriving them of a good. But when you give somebody therapy, you're not trying to deprive them of something. You're trying to do something for them, or at least something for society by changing them. But you're not trying to take away something that they regard as a good. Since punishment is like payment of a debt, once the payment has occurred, the debt's paid. Once the punishment has happened, the debt is paid. But there is no parallel, as it were, appropriate end to treatment. You treat someone until their condition has changed. And you do it for however long that takes, as long as it sort of pays to do so. But not, right, there's no, right, in other words, well, this is right, the next point, right? Punishment seeks to be proportional to the debt. That's why when the punishment is meted out, the debt is extinguished. Treatment is not proportional. The rationale for punishment, but not treatment, depends on the commission of a violative act. You can't punish someone if they haven't chosen to do something. But for treatment, what they did, in the light of which you're treating them, is understood merely as a manifestation of the need for treatment. Right? You're not doing it because, oh, now they've acted in a certain way that's wrong. What you're doing is saying, oh, now they did something which suggests they all along needed treatment. The crime in the treatment model is a symptom of the disease that requires treatment, or the condition that requires treatment. It's a signal that treatment is appropriate. It's not itself the justification for the treatment. The justification for the treatment is the underlying condition that is made manifest in the behavior, not the behavior itself. Yeah.
What if the only symptom that they're at?
What of it?
Like then the rationale for getting engaged would be that.
No, you can understand a behavior as a manifestation of a disposition, which disposition requires treatment without ever having any independent evidence of the disposition. That is to say, right, without, it's not as though you see the person behave a certain way and you think, oh, maybe there's an underlying condition. Now I'm going to go see whether there's an underlying condition, find evidence of that, and then treat. Right? Right, the idea is you just say, well, they did that, therefore they're the kind of thing that does that, and we don't want that kind because they're the kinds of things that do that. Yeah.
So there's something like an old coach of mine used to say, like in high school, trying to get better at tests. They like diagnose patterns, not. Does this fall get victim to that? Yes. That
yeah, I see what you. Yeah.
Kind of structure.
Well,
your act taken as
Well, I mean, the idea is that your act is taken as evidence of, not of a pattern, but of a disposition to act in a certain way, which, if we don't treat it, will yield a pattern. And there is, of course, something um, problematic in the idea that an individual action, you can read, as it were, you can read off a person's character from a single action. Yeah, that's indeed problematic. And no one is trying to defend the treatment model here. In fact, he's bringing it up because of how terrible he thinks it is.
But I mean, sorry,
Yeah, go ahead.
I don't want to put a, like, the best argument against the treatment system is to treat, so like, might there be some way to crack that potential difficulty? Like, could a treatment system have a requirement that multiple taken as a other treatment?
I don't think there are such things as treatment theorists. He's drawing, right, he's painting a conception of how you might think about what we ought to do with, in the light of behaviors that we don't like. And if you think of them as, right, things that we want to respond to by minimizing the likelihood of those behaviors, then that's kind of like thinking of them in terms of things that need to be treated. Or rather, if you think about them in such a way that the fact that the person made the choice to do that doesn't matter, then all you're left with, it looks like, is the option of thinking of it, well, right, we just want to make sure that doesn't happen. Right, quite independently of the fact that they chose it, we just want to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen. And even if we're wrong that it's happening once in a given instance is an indication of a problem on the part of, of a condition that that person has, still, there's a chance that it is an indication that the person has some condition, in which case, maybe we should treat them even if they don't have it, on the chance that they do. I mean, look, the whole idea here is that the reason to deal with violators is to keep such behaviors from happening. And it may well be that sometimes, right, the behaviors are bad. Here, let me put it this way. None of this has to do in the treatment system with justice for the individual, so that we only, give them this. We're not trying to harm them, right? And it's not about justice for the criminal or the victim. It's about what's the best way we can minimize the likelihood of these kinds of behaviors, and that may very well involve doing a lot of treating of people who don't need treatment, but who might. You don't know, right? So it doesn't matter. I mean, you vaccinate a lot of people, even though some of them would never get what it is you're vaccinating them for. I mean, part of what you need to do here is to not think in the treatment model, don't think of the treatment as being some sort of bad thing we're doing to the person who gets treated. That's not part of the treatment model. And if it were a bad thing, then it would have to be something that they deserved, right? But it's not about desert. It's about doing what most effectively eliminates those behaviors. And it may well be that the most effective way to eliminate those behaviors involves a lot of unnecessary treatment. Okay. Again, various procedural aspects of the punishment system, like burden of proof, prescription against self-incrimination, right to a jury, all those things we hold dear. They make sense in the case of punishment because we're trying to make sure that we only punish people who've made a choice to free ride. They make sense, but they don't make sense in the case of treatment where the only point is to minimize the incidence of the sort of behavior that we don't like. So, like, just to your point, burden of proof, there's no need to prove that the person really is likely to do that kind of thing. We're not punishing them after all. We're just doing our best to make sure that kind of thing doesn't really happen in the future. And we're not harming them. We're treating them. Right? Yeah.
Apparently, like the treatment would be coercive in some, because the pathology would run. The person who needs treatment would.
The point is, treatment is inconsistent with regarding the individual treated as a person. Right? It's right there regarded as a potential source of unwanted harms and injuries in the world. And that's how you treat them. That's how you think of them in the treatment model. A pure treatment model. And it's just sort of inappropriate mixing to think about the safeguards that they require so that we don't end up coercively treating them. I mean, as soon as you said coerce, right, you're outside the treatment model. And I think part of his point is if you really think of the treatment model seriously, you realize it doesn't engage at any level with the personhood of those who are subject to it. Their personhood is irrelevant. That's his point. So given these two alternatives, we can see what it means to say that a person has a right to punishment. What it amounts to is to say that they have a right to the kind of institutions and practices linked to the punishment system. They have a right to the punishment system because it treats them as persons and with respect, as opposed to mere objects that are potentially dangerous to be controlled. There are further problems with the therapy system. It treats humans like animals. It eliminates all grounds for notions like that of achievement, pride, etc., satisfaction. You don't deserve any pride for manifestations of pathological conditions that are not a matter of your choice. There's no room for the notion of what you deserve, what you've earned, because essentially there's no you in the picture. There's your body and stuff that occurs, but no actions, properly speaking, that are the products of will and choice. There's no room for the concept of resentment, because resentment implies one's reacting to not being treated as one deserves. So you say here, right? But the treatment is coercive, or maybe the person doesn't really have that condition. But the idea there is that, well, they ought to resent the treatment then. But resentment, right, is a feeling that is justified when it is in the light of having been wronged, which is being treated not in a harmful way, but in a way that you don't deserve. But desert has nothing to do with this. Anything society might take to be undesirable in a person is fair game for treatment. Not just things that they have chosen, not just violations of some agreement that they chose to make, but anything you don't like about them. There's no limit in the treatment system to what things we can regard as to be avoided. And finally, protests against treatment, right, will just be taken as symptoms of the illness that needs to be treated. Yeah, Sam.
I mean, animals do deserve something, right? They deserve to be free from pain. Is that what we're getting at when we say, like, we're not harming the creation of treatment or the...
Well, treatment needn't be painful. It's only incidentally painful. It may not be painful. I mean, when you have an itch, you treat it by scratching it. That doesn't hurt. Right. Now, the question whether animals deserve not to feel pain.
The prohibition of animals.
I'm not sure that the best argument there involves the idea that the animals deserve not to feel pain. It's just that it's bad for them to feel pain. Right? It's not as though we think that when the dog, actually does pee on the carpet, then it's perfectly fine to cause them pain, right? I mean, right? So,
Okay.
right? I mean, it's not a question of whether, battery farmed chickens, they didn't do anything wrong, therefore don't cause them pain. It's that animal pain it's just bad. I mean, okay. There could be other systems, for example, or rather. So this is a compelling case for punishment as opposed to treatment. If those are the only two options, punishment definitely better than treatment if those are the only two options, he thinks. But look, there might be other options. You might have a pure forgiveness system in which we still start with the contractarian view, and then anytime anybody violates the contract, well, we forgive them. Or you might have a system that involves shaming rather than punishing. He says, look, if a system of punishment deviates too much from justice, it's going to cease to be a system of punishment. So if we imagine it in such a way that therapy would be preferable, suppose the punishments were just super, super harsh, right? It's going to deviate from justice. It might look, right, a system of punishment in which punishments were truly draconian. That might make it look like, look, we'd be better off with treatment than that. If everybody, if you cut off people's hands for, jaywalking, well, we'd rather have a system of treatment than that. But that's no longer really a system of punishment because of the disproportionality, right? So what he says is any system of punishment that's sufficiently just to count as a system of punishment is going to be preferable to therapy. Now, a system of forgiveness, well, you couldn't have a pure system of forgiveness because the concept of forgiveness or pardoning only makes sense against the backdrop of the idea of wrongs that are, in fact, made up by the payment of debt. So if every debt were forgiven routinely, the whole idea that there's debt wouldn't make any sense anymore. It's only if people sometimes have to pay their debts that you can make sense of the idea of forgiving them. Finally, a shame system. Problem with a shame system is that shaming someone, to shame someone is to attack the person themselves as bad. Not a matter of treating their actions as transgressions, giving rise to a debt that can be paid. So the point is that once a debt is paid, the matter is over. Okay? But shame persists until the person changes. So in a shame system, there's no notion of a debt being paid and being capable of being paid off. Shaming goes to the person and not to their action, as it were. Okay. All of this can just be understood grandly as saying punishment system treats individuals as persons, the therapy system does not. We have a right to be treated as a person, so we have a right to the punishment system. To treat an individual as a person is to respond to them in a way that is determined by their choices, rather than by your own choices, disregarding theirs, or with indifference to their choices. Failing to treat someone as a person is a matter of treating them as a mere link in a causal chain to be manipulated for your own ends. That's what the treatment system does. One example of failing to treat someone as a person, but rather to treat them as a link in a causal chain to be manipulated. One example of that is coercion, or holding a gun to their head to get their wallet. That's just treating them as a link in a causal chain. You can predict that you will get the money if you put the gun to their head. But another is therapy. You're going to treat your condition so that you don't do that sort of thing again. So Morris actually takes care to distinguish coercion from the mere from manipulation via threat of harm. And one way to think of punishment is manipulation via threat of harm. And that looks a lot like coercion. But he wants to distinguish coercion from manipulation via threat of harm. For one thing, in a system of punishment, the rules apply equally to all, which is not so in a mere situation of coercion where individuals are singled out. For another thing, in a coercive situation, it's the coercer who violates the norms, whereas in the punishment system, it's the criminal who does. So we often think of, the government and its criminal, the system of criminal law as coercive. But he would say it's not really coercive. A coercive situation is where an individual violates norms to single out another individual to get them to do something by threat of harm. That's not the way the punishment system works. The coerced person, moreover, in a classic coercion situation, in no sense brings the harm upon themselves through their choices. But the criminal, right, does precisely that. So they're not merely coerced through punishment. All right. The right to be treated as a person, which is what underlies our right to the punishment system and therefore our right to be punished. So the right to be treated as a person is fundamental in that it belongs to all human beings in virtue of their humanity. It is, he says, natural, inalienable, and absolute. And it's important to understand these terms. So what does he mean by saying it's natural? Well, it means it attaches to them in virtue of their humanity. But that opens up a question, right? Well, we don't accord the right to be treated to a person as a person to all human beings. We don't accord it to children and to adults who are incompetent in the sense that their rational capacities are compromised. Okay, so what he says here is, look, children possess the right in a way that someone might possess a future interest in property. That is to say, the way that you treat children in light of their right to be treated as persons is that you treat them, you have an obligation to treat them not only eventually as persons, but now, right, in a way that facilitates their ability eventually to deserve to be treated as persons. So children are treated as persons, and the incompetent are treated as persons in now being treated in ways that will allow them, as best we can, to develop into people who can make rational choices, etc. So we have an obligation to children, which we wouldn't have if they weren't persons, to treat them in such a way as to develop their full rational personhood. Yeah.
And expect to develop.
Yeah, well, that's a great question. There are many things to be said about why we should care about them. One of them is that you might be one day, and don't you want it to be the case that when you are, you're treated with some dignity? But yeah, I mean, this argument, that problem is not an easy problem, and there's no reason to think there's an easy answer to it. But the general cases, if somebody's compromised in a way that you think maybe they can, they're not now functioning as a person, but they might be able to. Well, their right to be treated as a person, even though they aren't functioning as one now, can easily be seen as protecting their future personhood. Right? That's what it is to be treated, to be given that right. And when you start to be the sort of thing that deserves to be now treated in such a way as fosters your future personhood, that's a terribly difficult question. And let's not forget, though, that you might have the right to be treated as a person. Okay? That doesn't give you a right against anyone in particular that they should sacrifice significantly in order for you to be treated as a person. That's just a way of saying, even if you draw the line at when you've got to start treating something as a person very early, like when they're a zygote, that does not suffice to say that someone, namely a pregnant woman, has to give up everything she wants in the world in order to make sure that you flourish. Make sure I'm not misunderstood there. Okay. The right is also inalienable. You cannot transfer or waive this right. It makes no sense to say that the right can be treated as a person can be transferred. What can I transfer it to this computer screen? Can I transfer it to you? No, you already have such a right. It just doesn't make any sense to talk about transferring the right to be treated as a person the way it makes sense to transfer a right to use a car, right, to another person. Nor can it be waived. Why? A right is the sort of thing that makes it legitimate to complain if it's infringed. If I have a right to something, that makes it legitimately for me to complain if it's been infringed. Waiving that right makes it illegitimate to complain. So if I have a right to some performance under a contract, but I waive that right, and then you don't do that thing that you were contracted to do, which right I waived, I don't get to complain if you don't do it, because I waived the right to that. But here's the thing. It's always legitimate to complain of not being treated as a person. If I say to you, I waive my right for you to respect my choices, right? And then you disrespect my choices, I still have a right to complain about that. I'm not capable of waiving it. Finally, the right is absolute. What this means is that the right exists even when there are considerations that warrant not according it. That is to say, having a right so if I have a limited right, okay, that means that there are circumstances in which there are things I don't. Okay, your rights in property are limited. You don't have a right to do any old thing you want with your property. Okay, you don't have a right to. You have a right to drive your car. You don't have a right to hit other people with it. Okay, your right to use your car is limited. That is, you can do things with it that you don't have a right to do. But your right to be treated as a person is the sort of thing, right, that you still have, even though we're not going to treat you like a person. So think here of enemy combatants. Right? An enemy combatant is someone you can try to kill. Okay? That's not because their right to be treated as a person is limited in a way that they didn't have a right for me not to kill them, for me not to treat them as a person in killing them. They still had that right. It's just that we're at war, and I'm going to kill you anyway. But you still have the right to be treated as a person. Right? It may be justified to kill enemy combatants. It's not ordinarily justified to kill persons, but it may be justified to kill enemy combatants, but not because they're not persons, not because they don't have a right to be treated as persons. So that's the sense in which it's absolute. Finally, all rights and duties depend upon this right. To possess a right is to possess something that implies a constraint on the action of others. that presupposes that they have the capacity to control their actions in light of, that should say, in light of the rules, not or the rules. That implies that individuals are capable of choosing how to act on the basis of consideration of rules. Right? So the whole notion of a right depends upon the idea that persons are capable of free choice and deserving of respect. The denial of the right to be treated as a person, furthermore, the denial of the right to be treated as a person will also amount to the denial of any right to treatment. So the point here is, remember the therapy model. The therapy model treats therapy as something we may do to you. Okay? But the foundation of the punishment model, which is the right to be treated as a person, entails a positive right to therapy if you need it in order to protect your capacity to exercise your rights as a person. If you require treatment in order to behave with dignity and make choices, you're entitled to the treatment. The treatment model itself, or the therapy model itself, has no notions of entitlement, rights, duties at all. We may give you treatment in order to prevent you from doing things that we don't want you to do. But if we accept this idea of the right to be treated as a person and take it seriously, there will be occasions on which you have a right to treatment in order that we may respect your personhood. Okay. So to fail to treat people when they need it, just the way to fail to educate a child, is to disregard their rights as a person. So Rupert asks, wouldn't a major implication to the right not being able to be waived be along the line of someone committing a crime waiving their right to personhood would allow them to evade punishment? Yes, precisely. Precisely, Rupert. That's the main point of his saying you can't waive it, is to say it's not the sort of right, that your right to be punished is not the sort of thing you can waive, because it follows directly from your right to be treated as a person. Right? So we started off with this paradoxical idea. What do you mean I have a right to, I should, punishment is okay because I have a right to it. It's not a right I would ever want enforced. Yeah, but it's not one you can waive. Exactly. Good comment. And there was a previous comment as well. Problematic cursor here. Christopher says, seems easy to reconceive that the treatment option is only necessary to those who make the choice. To treat the option as necessary for those who make the choice. Well, that would be so if the only occasion on which a condition that made certain kinds of behavior probable were were accompanied by various things that we take as expressive of choice. That is to say, because the whole idea of choice, Christopher, doesn't appear in the treatment model. It's just not there. So when you talk about choice in the treatment model, what you must be talking about is just stuff people do with their bodies that, when we are talking about free choice, we take as indicative of their choice, but now we're just taking it as indicative of, for example, the kinds of things they say. Right? So just the point is, choice isn't on the scene at all in the treatment model. So there's no question of limiting occasions for treatment to situations in which a choice has been made. At most, there's a question of limiting occasions to treatment for situations in which people engage in the sorts of behaviors that, from the perspective of the punishment model, look like choices. But we're not in the punishment model, we're in the treatment model, so we'll have to give a completely different sort of description of what those situations are, and it won't be one involving the notion of choice. That's hard to get your head around, but really operating in two really distinct kinds of conceptual frameworks, and the conceptual framework pertinent to the treatment model doesn't involve such things as free choices, actions as opposed to movements. Some movements will be accompanied by chattering explanations that sound like something like rationalizations for why the action occurred, but in fact that's just more bodily movements that may or may not indicate a likelihood that this individual will move their bodies in ways that produces injury and therefore needs to be treated. Okay. Well, let's get a little bit, a couple of minutes into Hampton here, since we have time. Oh, I guess I do. But it's out of order. It should have been up here, and I already talked about it.
Oh, yeah.
It's out of order. I don't know what happened. Anyway, let me see if I can find what happened here. Sorry. I do want to, what? Stop that. Sorry, I'm being, that's what I wanted to open up. I thought I had opened it is the thing, but here it is. Okay, Gene Hampton on retributivism. So we've just seen Morris's justification of a retributist theory of punishment. And I contrasted it, he contrasted it with the therapy model, which is a kind of consequentialist version of punishment. And I contrasted retributivism with utilitarian consequentialism as well. And we can at least sort of understand the idea that of doing things to various people because of the benefits that that will provide. There's a sort of prima facie justification for treating people this way or that to be had in the fact that doing so will bring about the greatest happiness for the greatest number or something like that. It turns out that there are big problems for that, involving questions of justice and regard for persons as such. But at least on the face of it, we can see, a consequential good as being, in some measure, a reason why you should undertake some action, like, say, putting someone behind bars or fining them or something like that. The challenge of retributivism, which is one that Morris has just tried to meet, is to explain the purpose of punishment, given that it isn't the consequences. Given that it's not a matter of a benefit to be brought about in terms of utility or happiness or deterrence or something like that, and retributivism denies that it's any such thing. What is the purpose of punishment? If we give no answer at all to that question, or some completely vacuous answer like balancing the cosmic scales of justice, that's what retributivism is for, then we simply don't justify the harm that punishment surely does. And then retributivism just looks like some sort of violent expression of vengefulness or hatred. You harmed me, so I'm going to lash back at you and harm you. Okay, so what we're after here is a justification of the harm that punishment does. And it's important to distinguish a justification from an explanation. So John Mackey has argued in the following way. There's a teleological explanation grounded in natural selection for the emotion that gives rise to the desire to punishment. Something like this: in the past, creatures that reacted to harms with an emotion that led them to strike back at those who had harmed them, well, they had a selectional advantage in evolution. Okay, so the purpose of the vengeful emotion, right, is grounded in the adaptiveness of creatures that behave with such an emotion. Okay. But Hampton rejects this precisely because it fails to justify why we should punish. For one thing, emotions lack cognitive content. And so can't serve to justify actions. Only things with propositional content can function in justifications. That you have an emotion that leads you to do something can explain why you did it, but it cannot justify your doing it. Furthermore, this evolutionary sort of explanation can at best explain why we have the emotion. It does nothing to justify retribution against current offenders. It explains why we have an emotion that makes us want to punish them, to harm them, but it does nothing to show why they deserve it, any more than the organisms that harmed our ancestors and were therefore harmed in return deserved that harm. Or rather, any more than the fact that our ancestors lashed out itself shows that they deserved, that those they lashed out at deserved that harm. So this kind of account simply doesn't answer the question why punishment is justified. It explains why we want to punish, but not why we are justified in punishing. I'll stop there. We'll start up next time with her consideration and rejection of Morris's account that we just spent too long on. Okay. Any questions from the Teams group?
Thank you, Professor.
All right, see you next time. All right, have a good one.